Chapter 3, Part 3 of Principia Ethica. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. Principia Ethica by G. E. Moore. 51. In the second passage, to which I referred above, Professor Sidgwick returns from the discussion of virtue and pleasure, with which he has meanwhile been engaged, to consider what among the parts of human existence, to which, as we saw, he has limited the ultimate end, can really be considered as such end. What I have just said, of course, appears to me to destroy the force of this part of his argument too. If, as I think, other things than any part of human existence can be ends in themselves, then Professor Sidgwick cannot claim to have discovered the summum bonum when he has merely determined what parts of human existence are in themselves desirable. But this error may be admitted to be utterly insignificant in comparison with that which we are now about to discuss. It may be said, says Professor Sidgwick, that we may regard cognition of truth, contemplation of beauty, free or virtuous action, as in some measure preferable alternatives to pleasure or happiness, even though we admit that happiness must be included as a part of ultimate good. I think, however, that this view ought not to commend itself to the sober judgment of reflective persons. In order to show this, I must ask the reader to use the same twofold procedure that I before requested him to employ in considering the absolute and independent validity of common moral precepts. I appeal firstly to his intuitive judgment after due consideration of the question when fairly placed before it, and secondly to a comprehensive comparison of the ordinary judgments of mankind. As regards the first argument, to me at least, it seems clear after reflection that these objective relations of the conscious subject, when distinguished from the consciousness accompanying and resulting from them, are not ultimately and intrinsically desirable, any more than material or other objects are, when considered apart from any relation to conscious existence. Admitting that we have actual experience of such preferences have just been described, of which the ultimate object is something that is not merely consciousness, it still seems to me that when, to use Butler's phrase, we sit down in a cool hour, we can only justify to ourselves the importance that we attach to any of these objects by considering its conduciveness, in one way or another, to the happiness of sentient beings. The second arguments, that refer to the common sense of mankind, obviously cannot be made completely cogent, since, as above stated, several cultivated persons do habitually judge that knowledge, art, etc., not to speak of virtue, are ends independently of the pleasure derived from them. But we may urge not only that all these elements of ideal good are productive of pleasure in various ways, but also that they seem to obtain the commendation of common sense, roughly speaking, in proportion to the degree of this productiveness. This seems obviously true of beauty, and will hardly be denied in respect of any kind of social ideal. It is paradoxical to maintain that any degree of freedom or any form of social order would still be commonly regarded as desirable, even if we were certain that it had no tendency to promote the general happiness. The case of knowledge is rather more complex, but certainly common sense is most impressed with the value of knowledge when its fruitfulness has been demonstrated. It is, however, aware that experience has frequently shown how knowledge, long fruitless, may become unexpectedly fruitful, and how light may be shed on one part of the field of knowledge from another apparently remote. And even if any particular branch of scientific pursuit could be shown to be devoid of even this indirect utility, it would still deserve some respect on utilitarian grounds, both as furnishing to the inquirer the refined and innocent pleasures of curiosity, and because the intellectual disposition which it exhibits and sustains is likely on the whole to produce fruitful knowledge. Still, in cases approximating to this last, common sense is somewhat disposed to complain of the misdirection of valuable effort, so that the meed of honor commonly paid to science seems to be graduated, though perhaps unconsciously, by a tolerable exact utilitarian scale. Certainly, the moment the legitimacy of any branch of scientific inquiry is seriously disputed, as in the recent case of vivisection, the controversy on both sides is generally conducted on an avowedly utilitarian basis. The case of virtue requires special consideration, since the encouragement in each other of virtuous impulses and dispositions is a main aim of men's ordinary moral discourse, so that even to raise the question whether this encouragement can go too far has a paradoxical air. Still, our experience includes rare and exceptional cases in which the concentration of effort on the cultivation of virtue has seemed to have effects adverse to general happiness, through being intensified to the point of moral fanaticism, and so involving a neglect of other conditions of happiness. If, then, we admit as actual or possible such infelicific effects of the cultivation of virtue, I think we shall also generally admit that, in the case supposed, conduciveness to general happiness should be the criterion for deciding how far the cultivation of virtue should be carried. There we have Professor Sidgwick's argument completed. We ought not, he thinks, to aim at knowing the truth or at contemplating beauty, except in so far as such knowledge or such contemplation contributes to increase the pleasure or to diminish the pain of sentient beings. Pleasure alone is good for its own sake. Knowledge of the truth is good only as a means to pleasure. 52. Let us consider what this means. What is pleasure? It is certainly something of which we may be conscious, and which therefore may be distinguished from our consciousness of it. What I wish first to ask is this: can it really be said that we value pleasure, except in so far as we are conscious of it? Should we think that the attainment of pleasure, of which we never were and never could be conscious, was something to be aimed at for its own sake? It may be impossible that such pleasure should ever exist, that it should ever be thus divorced from consciousness, although there is certainly much reason to believe that it is not only possible but very common. But even supposing that it were impossible, that is quite irrelevant. Our question is it the pleasure, as distinct from the consciousness of it, that we set value on? Do we think the pleasure valuable in itself, or must we insist that, if we are to think the pleasure good, we must have consciousness of it too? This consideration is very well put by Socrates in Plato's dialogue Philebus 21a. Would you accept, Protarchus, says Socrates, to live your whole life in the enjoyment of the greatest pleasures? Of course I would, says Protarchus. Socrates: then would you think you needed anything else besides, if you possessed this one blessing in completeness? Protarchus: certainly not. Socrates: consider what you are saying. You would not need to be wise and intelligent and reasonable, nor anything like this. Would you not even care to keep your sight? Protarchus: why should I? I suppose I should have all I want, if I was pleased. Socrates: well, then, supposing you lived so, you would enjoy always throughout your life the greatest pleasure? Protarchus: of course. Socrates: but on the other hand, inasmuch as you would not possess intelligence and memory and knowledge and true opinion, you would in the first place necessarily be without the knowledge whether you were pleased or not, for you would be devoid of any kind of wisdom. You admit this? Protarchus: I do. The consequence is absolutely necessary. Socrates: well, then, besides this, not having memory, you must also be unable to remember even that you ever were pleased. Of the pleasure which falls upon you at the moment, not the least vestige must afterwards remain. And again, not having true opinion, you cannot think that you are pleased when you are. And being bereft of your reasoning faculties, you cannot even have the power to reckon that you will be pleased in future. You must live the life of an oyster or of some other of those living creatures whose home is the seas and whose souls are concealed in shelly bodies. Is all this so, or can we think otherwise than this? Protarchus: how can we? Socrates: well, then, can we think such a life desirable? Protarchus: Socrates, your reasoning has left me utterly dumb. Socrates, we see, persuades Protarchus that hedonism is absurd. If you are really going to maintain that pleasure alone is good as an end, we must maintain that it is good, whether we are conscious of it or not. We must declare it reasonable to take as our ideal, an unattainable ideal it may be, that we should be as happy as possible, even on condition that we never know and never can know that we are happy. We must be willing to sell in exchange for the mere happiness every vestige of knowledge, both in ourselves and in others, both of happiness itself and of every other thing. Can we really still disagree? Can anyone still declare it obvious that this is reasonable, that pleasure alone is good as an end? The case, it is plain, is just like that of the colours, only, as yet, not nearly so strong. It is far more possible that we should some day be able to produce the intensest pleasure, without any consciousness that it is there, than that we should be able to produce more colour, without its being any particular colour. Pleasure and consciousness can be far more easily distinguished from one another than colour from the particular colours. And yet even if this were not so, we should be bound to distinguish them if we really wish to declare pleasure alone to be our ultimate end. Even if consciousness were an inseparable accompaniment of pleasure, a sine qua non of its existence, yet if pleasure is the only end, we are bound to call consciousness a mere means to it, in any intelligible sense that can be given to the word means. And if, on the other hand, as I hope is now plain, the pleasure would be comparatively valueless without consciousness, then we are bound to say that pleasure is not the only end, that some consciousness at least must be included with it as a veritable part of the end. For our question is now solely what the end is. It is quite another question how far that end may be attainable by itself, or must involve the simultaneous attainment of other things. It may well be that the practical conclusions at which utilitarians do arrive, and even those at which they ought logically to arrive, are not far from the truth. But in so far as the reason for holding these conclusions to be true is that pleasure alone is good as an end, they are absolutely wrong, and it is with reasons that we are chiefly concerned in any scientific ethics. 53. It seems then clear that hedonism is an error, so far as it maintains that pleasure alone, and not the consciousness of pleasure, is the sole good. And this error seems largely due to the fallacy which I pointed out above in Mill, the fallacy of confusing means and end. It is falsely supposed that, since pleasure must always be accompanied by consciousness, which is itself extremely doubtful, therefore it is indifferent whether we say that pleasure, or the consciousness of pleasure, is the sole good. Practically, of course, it would be indifferent at which we aimed, if it were certain that we could not get the one without the other, but where the question is of what is good in itself, where we ask, for the sake of what is it desirable to get that which we aim at, the distinction is by no means unimportant. Here we are placed before an exclusive alternative. Either pleasure by itself, even though we can't get it, would be all that is desirable, or a consciousness of it would be more desirable still. Both these propositions cannot be true, and I think it is plain that the latter is true, whence it follows that pleasure is not the sole good. Still it may be said that, even if consciousness of pleasure, and not pleasure alone, is the sole good, this conclusion is not very damaging to hedonism. It may be said that hedonists have always meant by pleasure the consciousness of pleasure, though they have not been at pains to say so, and this, I think, is in the main true. To correct their formula in this respect could, therefore, only be a matter of practical importance, if it is possible to produce pleasure without producing consciousness of it. But even this importance, which I think our conclusion so far really has, is, I admit, comparatively slight. What I wish to maintain is that even consciousness of pleasure is not the sole good, that indeed it is absurd so to regard it, and the chief importance of what has been said so far lies in the fact that the same method which shews that consciousness of pleasure is more valuable than pleasure seems also to shew that consciousness of pleasure is itself far less valuable than other things. The supposition that consciousness of pleasure is the sole good is due to a neglect of the same distinctions which have encouraged the careless assertion that pleasure is the sole good. The method which I employed in order to shew that pleasure itself was not the sole good was that of considering what value we should attach to it if it existed in absolute isolation, stripped of all its usual accompaniments. And this is, in fact, the only method that can be safely used when we wish to discover what degree of value a thing has in itself. The necessity of employing this method will be best established by a discussion of the arguments used by Professor Sidgwick in the passage last quoted, and by an exposure of the manner in which they are calculated to mislead. 54. With regard to the second of them, it only maintains that other things which might be supposed to share with pleasure the attribute of goodness seem to obtain the commendation of common sense, roughly speaking, in proportion to the degree of their productiveness of pleasure. Whether even this rough proportion holds between the commendation of common sense and the philosophic effects of that which it commends is a question extremely difficult to determine, and we need not enter into it here. For even assuming it to be true, and assuming the judgments of common sense to be on the whole correct, what would it shew? It would shew certainly that pleasure was a good criterion of right action, that the same conduct which produced most pleasure would also produce most good on the whole. But this would by no means entitle us to the conclusion that the greatest pleasure constituted what was best on the whole. It would still leave open the alternative that the greatest quantity of pleasure was as a matter of fact, under actual conditions, generally accompanied by the greatest quantity of other goods, and that it therefore was not the sole good. It might indeed seem to be a strange coincidence that these two things should always, even in this world, be in proportion to one another. But the strangeness of this coincidence will certainly not entitle us to argue directly that it does not exist, that it is an illusion, due to the fact that pleasure is really the sole good. The coincidence may be susceptible of other explanations, and it would even be our duty to accept it unexplained, if direct intuition seemed to declare that pleasure was not the sole good. Moreover, it must be remembered that the need for assuming such a coincidence rests in any case upon the extremely doubtful proposition that philosophic effects are roughly in proportion to the approval of common sense. And it should be observed that, though Professor Sidgwick maintains this to be the case, his detailed illustrations only tend to shew the very different proposition that a thing is not held to be good unless it gives a balance of pleasure, not that the degree of commendation is in proportion to the quantity of pleasure. 55. The decision, then, must rest upon Professor Sidgwick's first argument, the appeal to our intuitive judgment after due consideration of the question when fairly placed before it. And here it seems to me plain that Professor Sidgwick has failed, in two essential respects, to place the question fairly before either himself or his reader. 1. What he has to shew is, as he says himself, not merely that happiness must be included as a part of ultimate good. This view, he says, ought not to commend itself to the sober judgment of reflective persons. And why? Because these objective relations, when distinguished from the consciousness accompanying and resulting from them, are not ultimately and intrinsically desirable. Now this reason, which is offered as shewing that to consider happiness as a mere part of ultimate good does not meet the facts of intuition, is, on the contrary, only sufficient to shew that it is a part of ultimate good. For from the fact that no value resides in any part of a whole considered by itself, we cannot infer that all the value belonging to the whole does reside in the other part, considered by itself. Even if we admit that there is much value in the enjoyment of beauty, and none in the mere contemplation of it, which is one of the constituents of that complex fact, it does not follow that all the value belongs to the other constituents, namely, the pleasure which we take in contemplating it. It is quite possible that this constituent also has no value in itself, that the value belongs to the whole state, and to that only, so that both the pleasure and the contemplation are mere parts of the good, and both of them equally necessary parts. In short, Professor Sidgwick's argument here depends upon the neglect of that principle, which I tried to explain in my first chapter, and which I said I should call the principle of organic relations. The argument is calculated to mislead, because it supposes that, if we see a whole state to be valuable, and also see that one element of that state has no value by itself, then the other element, by itself, must have all the value which belongs to the whole state. The fact is, on the contrary, that since the whole may be organic, the other element need have no value whatever, and that even if it have some, the value of the whole may be very much greater. For this reason, as well as to avoid confusion between means and ends, it is absolutely essential to consider each distinguishing quality in isolation in order to decide what value it possesses. Professor Sidgwick, on the other hand, applies this method of isolation only to one element in the wholes he is considering. He does not ask the question, if consciousness of pleasure existed absolutely by itself, would a sober judgment be able to attribute much value to it? It is, in fact, always misleading to take a whole that is valuable, or the reverse, and then to ask simply, to which of its constituents does this whole owe its value or its vileness? It may well be that it owes it to none, and if one of them does appear to have some value in itself, we shall be led into the grave error of supposing that all the value of the whole belongs to it alone. It seems to me that this error has commonly been committed with regard to pleasure. Pleasure does seem to be a necessary constituent of most valuable wholes, and since the other constituents into which we may analyze them may easily seem not to have any value, it is natural to suppose that all the value belongs to pleasure. That this natural supposition does not follow from the premises is certain, and that it is, on the contrary, ridiculously far from the truth appears evident to my reflective judgment. If we apply either to pleasure or to consciousness of pleasure the only safe method, that of isolation, and ask ourselves, could we accept as a very good thing that mere consciousness of pleasure and absolutely nothing else should exist even in the greatest quantities? I think that we have no doubt about answering no. Far less can we accept this as the sole good. Even if we accept Professor Sidgwick's implication, which yet appears to me extremely doubtful, that consciousness of pleasure has a greater value by itself than contemplation of beauty, it seems to me that a pleasurable contemplation of beauty has certainly an immeasurably greater value than mere consciousness of pleasure. In favor of this conclusion I can appeal with confidence to the sober judgment of reflective persons. 56. 2. That the value of a pleasurable whole does not belong solely to the pleasure which it contains may, I think, be made still plainer by consideration of another point in which Professor Sidgwick's argument is defective. Professor Sidgwick maintains, as we saw, the doubtful proposition that the conduciveness to pleasure of a thing is in rough proportion to its commendation by common sense. But he does not maintain, what would be undoubtedly false, that the pleasantness of every state is in proportion to the commendation of that state. In other words, it is only when you take into account the whole consequences of any state that he is able to maintain the coincidence of quantity of pleasure with the objects approved by common sense. If we consider each state by itself and ask what is the judgment of common sense as to its goodness as an end, quite apart from its goodness as a means, there can be no doubt that common sense holds many much less pleasant states to be better than many far more pleasant. That it holds with Mill that there are higher pleasures which are more valuable though less pleasant than those that are lower. Professor Sidgwick might of course maintain that in this common sense is merely confusing means and ends, that what it holds to be better as an end is in reality only better as a means. But I think his argument is defective in that he does not seem to see sufficiently plainly that as far as intuitions of goodness as an end are concerned, he is running grossly counter to common sense; that he does not emphasize sufficiently the distinction between immediate pleasantness and conduciveness to pleasure. In order to place fairly before us the question what is good as an end, we must take states that are immediately pleasant and ask if the more pleasant are always also the better, and whether, if some that are less pleasant appear to be so, it is only because we think they are likely to increase the number of the more pleasant. That common sense would deny both these suppositions, and rightly so, appears to me indubitable. It is commonly held that certain of what would be called the lowest form of sexual enjoyment, for instance, are positively bad, although it is by no means clear that they are not the most pleasant states we ever experience. Common sense would certainly not think it a sufficient justification for the pursuit of what Professor Sidgwick calls the refined pleasures here and now, that they are the best means to the future attainment of a heaven in which there would be no more refined pleasures, no contemplation of beauty, no personal affections, but in which the greatest possible pleasure would be obtained by a perpetual indulgence in bestiality. Yet Professor Sidgwick would be bound to hold that, if the greatest possible pleasure could be obtained in this way, and if it were attainable, such a state of things would be a heaven indeed, and that all human endeavours should be devoted to its realization. I venture to think that this view is as false as it is paradoxical. 57. It seems to me, then, that if we place fairly before us the question, is consciousness of pleasure the sole good, the answer must be no, and with this the last defence of hedonism has been broken down. In order to put the question fairly, we must isolate consciousness of pleasure. We must ask, suppose we were consciousness of pleasure only, and of nothing else, not even that we were consciousness, would that state of things, however great the quantity, be very desirable? No one, I think, can suppose it so. On the other hand, it seems quite plain that we do regard as very desirable many complicated states of minds, in which the consciousness of pleasure is combined with consciousness of other things, states which we call enjoyment of so and so. If this is correct, then it follows that consciousness of pleasure is not the sole good, and that many other states, in which it is included only as part, are much better than it. Once we recognize the principle of organic unities, any objection to this conclusion founded on the supposed fact that the other elements of such states have no value in themselves must disappear, and I do not know that I need say any more in refutation of hedonism. 58. It only remains to say something of the two forms in which a hedonistic doctrine is commonly held, egoism and utilitarianism. Egoism, as a form of hedonism, is the doctrine which holds that we ought each of us to pursue our own greatest happiness as our ultimate end. The doctrine will, of course, admit that sometimes the best means to this end will be to give pleasure to others. We shall, for instance, by so doing, procure for ourselves the pleasure of sympathy, of freedom from interference, and of self-esteem. And these pleasures, which we may procure by sometimes aiming directly at the happiness of other persons, may be greater than any we could otherwise get. Egoism in this sense must therefore be carefully distinguished from egoism in another sense, the sense in which altruism is its proper opposite. Egoism, as commonly opposed to altruism, is apt to denote merely selfishness. In this sense a man is an egoist, if all his actions are actually directed towards gaining pleasure for himself, whether he holds that he ought to act so because he will thereby obtain for himself the greatest possible happiness on the whole, or not. Egoism may accordingly be used to denote the theory that we should always aim at getting pleasure for ourselves, because that is the best means to the ultimate end, whether the ultimate end be our own greatest pleasure or not. Altruism, on the other hand, may denote the theory that we ought always to aim at other people's happiness on the ground that this is the best means of securing our own as well as theirs. Accordingly, an egoist, in the sense in which I am now going to talk of egoism, an egoist who holds that his own greatest happiness is the ultimate end, may at the same time be an altruist. He may hold that he ought to love his neighbor as the best means to being happy himself, and conversely an egoist in the other sense may at the same time be a utilitarian. He may hold that he ought always to direct his efforts towards getting pleasure for himself on the ground that he is therefore most likely to increase the general sum of happiness. End of chapter 3, part 3.